Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Now, as ever, to the papers. One image dominates, as you've seen from the news. Abedi, the bomber, just moments before he set the bomb off. There's the Observer with a story saying that we need the EU to help us combat terror. Terrorism experts have told the Prime Minister. There's the Sun, minutes from mass murder, the same picture. And again, the Sunday Mirror, moments before massacre. The Sunday Telegraph has a very small version of the picture there. And the royal presence at the Manchester commemorations. Their story is about a minister attacking the social media for being duplicitous in failing to halt terror attacks. We're going to hear a lot more about that, I suspect, in the programme to come. And their finding is the Sunday Times. Nervous Tories to relaunch May's campaign, they say. Of all the opinion polls out today, it's the Sunday Times one that shows the gap closest. And they're making a lot of that. Then again, the picture of Abedi and many other stories. So an awful lot to talk about. Craig Oliver, I guess it's a morning of contrast in terms of the newspapers when it comes to the terror attack.
Yeah, and I think that contrast is summed up by these two photographs here, one of which is Salman Abedi, a sociopath just minutes before committing mass murder. And trying to work out what on earth was going through his head at that time. He looks incredibly calm and it's an extraordinary image. But actually, the reality, I think, the most interesting thing is to look at some of the more human aspects of this. And I think the papers do this very well. The Sunday Mirror has got an article about Charlotte Brownhill, who is a nurse in A&E. And she talks about scans showed nuts and bolts inside bodies. It's something I'll never forget. And I thought the most touching thing was at the end when she says, "When I got home, I cried because the reality was only just sinking in. My only way of coping is to think of the goodness we saw that night and in the days since." And I think in all the politicking around the security, remembering these people and the price they paid is still really important.
It's also interesting to remember that, of course, it's become slightly fashionable to sort of have a go at NHS managers, but that happens, that sort of care, because of the dedication of NHS staff and because, frankly, it is prepared for, and there are trials and tests and practices, and that's why the NHS was and other emergency services were able to step up in the way in which they did on Monday night, really impressively.
And, of course, when you were Home Secretary, one of the things you would be doing when it comes to these kind of events is trying to track where the bombers have come from. And you have got a story, I think, in the Sunday Telegraph.
There's some really interesting analysis, actually, in the papers today about the international links to the current terror threat and of actually the sort of history of Abedi and his family and their links to Libya and the Libyan Islamic fighting group, etc. This is a challenge for terrorism because this threat changes over time. 10 years ago, we were talking about Afghanistan, Pakistan, the border, the threat from Al-Qaeda. Actually, there was a lot of focus on the threat from jihadists travelling backwards and forwards to Syria. And here we see a threat that actually appears to have been at least prompted by links to Libya.
And, of course, it has to be said that Libya collapsed as a state on David Cameron's watch. It was our intervention there that knocked out the Gaddafi regime and unfortunately left a failed state, which Abedi has.
Well, you see the reality of the complication of this, and when you look at the Middle East, the tendency is to want to look and see that there's goodies and baddies, and the reality is it's a very, very complex situation and an extremely difficult one, and you're right, this week has shown that.
John Soper, let's turn to you. A lot of social media coverage of this, of course, as well.
Yes, of course, and I think that this is one of the areas where you feel that the technology of social media is so far ahead of any policy that knows quite how to deal with it. And so you've got the security minister, as you were saying in the introduction, Ben Wallace, talking about the duplicity, completely duplicitous social media companies for flogging users' personal information to questionable companies but refusing to help terror investigations. And you're seeing it all over the world where you've got law enforcement agencies who would love to get hold of some of the data that these companies have got. You're selling a product if you are one of the big technology companies and you want to encrypt it so your customers' material can't be stolen, and that is a major bar to investigation.
But this is all about who in the modern world is most powerful. Are they the people running WhatsApp or national governments? And it's no longer clear who's really got the whip hand.
It's very far from clear. But, you know, and people obviously, understandably, in normal times, talk about their privacy and the right to privacy and guarding their own data. And when you get something like this, and it happened after the San Bernardino attack in California, where they found a phone, but they couldn't break into it, that people suddenly say, it's a matter of national security that we can.
I think at this point we haven't even mentioned the words general election, but we are in the middle of a general election campaign. Theresa May's got an interview in The Sun, I think, not surprisingly, which she's taken. Sorry, we haven't got it there.
She's written, she's written an article in The Sun which is understandably about the security issues today. But I think that if you read most of the newspapers today, what you see is coverage of how is the campaign going for each party. And there's a huge amount of stuff in here about the wobble in the Conservative Party over the last week. And Tim Shipman's done a piece in the Sunday Times where he quotes an MP saying, it's a major cock-up. Corbyn can't win this, but we could lose it. And we've been given a bloody good go at that. All the manifesto offered was blood, sweat and tears.
There is a real feeling that just before the Manchester massacre, there was a big wobble, the U-turn over social care, and a real sense that the campaign was not going as planned.
And if you run your campaign on the basis of your leader being strong and stable, and you are arguing that actually we need to re-elect this person to handle the very difficult Brexit negotiations, and then you have a monster mess-up, essentially, in your manifesto and your plans, that is going to cause, rightly, is going to cause a wobble, and people are going to wonder about what it is they're being asked to vote for.
And the message from the Conservatives now is we want to focus again on leadership, and if there's one word that we want to keep repeating, it's Corbyn, Corbyn, Corbyn. And you pick that up from the Mail interview with Amber Rudd, who's coming on the programme.
Yes, and Simon Walters, their excellent political editor, has done an interview with her in which he says, you know, are you suggesting it would mean a greater risk of another terrorist atrocity if Corbyn became Prime Minister? Ms Rudd stressed she was not linking it to the Manchester bomb, but added, it absolutely does. Yes, and I think that you're seeing kind of, and Theresa May at her news conference that I went to at the G7 Friday evening, she also was trying to make absolutely clear the link between, you know, national security, safe with me, at risk if you elect Jeremy Corbyn as well.
And of course, Jeremy Corbyn does have some problems in his record, looking back, to say the least, his connections with the IRA and all the rest of it in the past. But it's very, very difficult in the middle of an election campaign to accuse somebody else of supporting terrorism after something like Manchester. This question of good taste and what's appropriate and reasonable to say is very, very hard for politicians to get right.
Which is why I mean, I agree with you that, you know, the terror attack was terrible. The juxtaposition with the general election campaign, which almost seems sort of naff to talk about, but actually it is casting a shadow. And in one way, you need the general election campaign actually to get back on track, because it's that democratic process, which of course the terror attack was partly against. But it's also difficult to judge rightly. And this seems to me to be a misjudgment to start talking about how many people are going to get killed under different
I mean, I think to be fair to the Home Secretary, what's actually happened here, she's been asked the question and she's made the mistake in politics of actually answering it. And actually what we need to do is get this onto who's best to look after security. But having said all this stuff about the wobbles and the difficulty of the Conservative campaign this week, I think that The Sun actually gives a good dash of cold water to the face and just reminds people of what's really happening here. And if you look at this graphic in The Sun, Tories 46%, Labour 32%, on the issue of the economy, May 43%, Corbyn 24%, on security, May 41%, Corbyn 17%. So let's not get carried away here.
2 weeks ago, Craig.
Yeah, well, political historians, I think, would say in most election campaigns what happens is ups, there's downs, there's spills, there's thrills, and at the end of them you get more or less the result that you expected right at the beginning.
Yeah, I agree with that, and that's the lesson of most campaigns. But there is other bits of collateral damage that can happen during the campaign as well. And I was kind of struck by an Observer kind of research that says that favourability ratings for Theresa May, suggesting that more than a third of voters say their opinion of the Prime Minister is more negative than at the start of the campaign. 25% say it's more positive. And for Jeremy Corbyn, the reverse. And actually, as the campaign has gone on, he seems to have grown in popularity.
He's a real campaigner. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Craig Oliver, everybody is losing it a bit. They're exhausted, they're tired, they're snapping. It happens in every election campaign. You've both been involved in the atmosphere inside. We now see that the Prime Minister's special advisors are allegedly feuding. Lots of people are leaking from campaign headquarters. run by Linton Crosby.
Yeah, I mean, I think having worked with Linton in the past, the thing that he was absolutely right on was that he does not want a running commentary on the campaign in the press. And I think, unfortunately, what you're seeing today it's not gone brilliantly, because there is quite a lot of running commentary on the campaign. And the thing is, if you're behind the scenes, if you're an aide or an advisor, you don't want to become the story. And what you can see is that a lot of the media are actually moving a lot of behind-the-scenes people to front and centre and asking questions about that. And I think that that is something that in any campaign you want to be very careful about. Actually, there are not many stories in the papers today of any campaign saying this is something positive we will do.
If you have as big a wobble as happened last Monday with that social care promise, it's very difficult to keep things together, and it seems quite clear that people are sort of staking out their position. I never supported it anyway, I'm going to brief that. That's in one way understandable, but incredibly unhelpful for a campaign that's supposed to be strong and stable.
And destructive, yeah.
All right, well, let's move to politics elsewhere. John, you've been following Trump tours, as we've been calling them. We've all enjoyed that picture of him moving the guy aside in Montenegro, that real alpha male moment.
The Montenegro manoeuvre, the best bit of it was not just the manoeuvre, but when he did it, he went with his jacket afterwards, as if to say, job done, I'm at the front of the line now.
We definitely need a bit more machismo in international politics.
So he's now arrived back in Washington, and he's had a holiday away from all the headlines that are crowding in.
Well, I was going to ask about that, because I guess the sort of liberal fantasy from the moment he was elected is that he's going to be impeached. He won't last long. And it's just beginning to look a little bit less like a fantasy.
Yes, and I think there are problems mounting up. I mean, there's the story that's, I mean, this is from the New York Times. Trump returns to crisis over Kushner as White House tries to contain the issue. It's a very similar story in the Wall Street Journal. Jared Kushner considered setting up secret communications with Russia and this sort of supposed back channel. So everybody is lawyering up at the White House. The other big thing is this, the leak of the conversation that Donald Trump had with Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, where he called Comey a nut job. That was kind of got a lot of the headlines. The really important bit was when he said, you know what, I had a lot of pressure on me, but now that I've got rid of my FBI director, that has gone. That leads to, are you obstructing justice? And that could lead to impeachment.
And this is not a rumour. This is probably a leaked minute.
Yes, it's not just a conversation that someone has recounted to the New York Times. It seems that that was the official minute of the meeting, saying that the president thought he was a nut job and that the pressure had been relieved and that by getting rid of him, things had got easier. If that's the case, you've got a special counsel now investigating the Russia links. It may be that there is no original Russia link, but the attempts to kind of cover things up and maybe fire the FBI director because of the job he was doing on Russia.
It's always the cover-up that gets
always the cover-up.
One of the great cliches.
Yeah.
And, of course, this does connect, sorry, I was going to say, this does connect to our election campaign and the terrible events here, doesn't it, Jackie Smith, because of all the leaks coming from outside, from the US. Which
I'm interested in whether or not, when he gets back to Washington, he's going to do anything about the leak of the information related to the investigation in Manchester, which looked pretty outrageous to me, and obviously the Greater Manchester Police were pretty angry about it.
I tell you what was fascinating. It happened when we were in Brussels on the kind of leg of the world tour. The White House staff came up to me and said, why are you making such a big... Why are the Brits making such a big fuss about this? And the journalists were... There's a very different culture in the US about revealing information. It seemed pretty commonplace what appeared in the New York Times.
Fascinating. I could sit here and talk about this all day, but sadly we've run out of time. Thank you, all of you, very much indeed.
Well, let's have a look at what's on the front pages this morning, shall we? A number of papers, including the Mail on Sunday, lead with a newly released image of Salman Abedi. The Sun on Sunday has the same picture under the headline, Minutes from Mass Murder. Theresa May tells of her anguish over the attack in the Sunday Express. An attack on social media firms by Security Minister Ben Wallace is the lead on the Sunday Telegraph. The Observer says Britain needs full security cooperation with the EU after Brexit. That's in order to fight terrorism. The Sunday Times says the Conservatives will relaunch their election campaign amid infighting over their manifesto. In the Scottish Sunday Herald, Nicola Sturgeon says there are just 10 days to save Scotland from the Tories. And Scotland on Sunday says it's now or never for Jeremy Corbyn as he visits Glasgow today. Well, joining us in the studio now to talk about all the big stories today are the political commentator for the Herald, Ian McWhirter, and the Spectator's Scotland editor, Alex Massey. Thank you very much for both being with us today. It feels like we should start off with the terror attack that just devastated the UK, Scotland, England, everywhere really. And we've got that incredible picture of the man responsible on lots of the front pages today. Yeah, and there's no news story, but obviously the Sunday papers are dominated by events in Manchester last week in the bombing, and they all have this picture, the latest picture to be released before he actually ignited the bomb that killed 22 people so tragically in Manchester. And I mean, Hannah Arendt talked about the banality of evil, and I think that is summed up by this picture, because he looks like, you know, an ordinary young man, classless, dressed in contemporary, vaguely hip-hop clothing. He could be a computer programmer, and nothing could be less like the image we have of Islamic extremism. And this is the tremendous problem, obviously, that the security forces have, because these people are hiding in plain sight, and they're looking in this image as a very benign members of our society. And we found out as well, didn't we, this week, just how many people have been flagged to the security services. I mean, it's tens of thousands. It's impossible to track them all, particularly, if, as you say, if they look like they could be any one of us. Well, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the difficulties that the security forces face, is that, you know, they have to be lucky, if you like, all the time, whereas their opponents, the people they're targeting, keeping tabs on, only have to be lucky once. And that, I think, is something that the public actually implicitly recognises and understands, and has not a willing acceptance of, but does appreciate that this is the case. Because you see, I think you've seen that in some of the reaction to the week's horrifying events in Manchester, that there hasn't actually been very much of a dramatic reaction in terms of we must now do something to make this less likely in the future, in terms of drastic or draconian measures. There are some people in the papers today suggesting things like internment and so on, but you know, we have past experience of that, and we know that in Northern Ireland and so on, internment didn't work, and so I think for that sort of reason, a lot of people are going to reject this. You know, but the way that, you know, the Manchester attack has been felt across the country. I mean, you get there's a good sense of this from a piece by Kevin McKenna in The Observer. He's gone to the Isle of Barra, in the Western Isles and the Outer Hebrides, where, you know, 2 teenage girls had travelled down to Manchester for the concert. One of them has died, the other remains in hospital. He's got a very touching piece with some of the residents of what is a tiny community, only 1,000 people. But that's a reminder that, you know, Manchester is a city that isn't just for Mancunians and so on. You know, you have people who were at that concert from across the north of England, from parts of Scotland as well, and really, you know, Manchester and all parts north, and so while the immediate impact is obviously felt there and so on, the tentacles of these things spread right across the country. Yeah, absolutely. I think what's so shocking about it as well is who has been targeted. I mean, this is young teenage girls. It feels like it was a very deliberate attempt to target these young women who were at a pop concert. I mean, it's difficult to comprehend. The horror is well expressed throughout the comment pages, but people are looking a little behind this as well. As Alex says, many of the more draconian solutions like internment have been written off, but there is this continuing debate about whether or not British foreign policy had any contribution, which Jeremy Corbyn raised earlier this week, to Islamic terrorism, which of course has been the subject because it was mentioned by Jeremy Corbyn in his speech last week. And we have today in the Sunday Post, interestingly enough, we have a piece from the son of the Lockerbie bomber. Now, of course, the greatest terrorist atrocity ever in Britain was the Lockerbie bombing in 1988, when 273 people were killed when Pan Am 103 was shot down over Lockerbie in Scotland. This is the son of the man who was convicted of being responsible for that, and he's pointing out that this will happen again. That in these shifting alliances of which we're involved with in the Middle East, where one minute we're uniting with people opposing Gaddafi, then we're opposing the people who oppose Gaddafi, then we're letting people like Salman Abedi, who is the Manchester bomber, to go freely to and from Libya, because he was at one time seen as it were, on our side. This is a tremendous difficulty, and he's saying because the West has abandoned Libya, we're going to see a lot more of these atrocities. Very complex picture. Let's move on to talk politics, shall we? There's a story in the Sunday Times today showing a slight tightening of the polls. I mean, this is what we've seen all week, isn't it? These kind of, perhaps the walkover that many people thought Theresa May would have doesn't quite seem to be coming to fruition. And we've got this idea, the suggestion in the Sunday Times today that the Conservatives are relaunching their campaign with a bit of a change of tack.
Absolutely. I mean, it's Tim Shipman's splash and so on. The sort of warfare inside the Conservative Party, inside Downing Street, inside Theresa May's extremely close-knit and hermetically sealed team of advisors. That we have Nick Timothy, who was responsible for the so-called dementia tax, being castigated by Fiona Hill, the Prime Minister's other chief of staff.
And we've never really seen any splits between these two individuals
exactly.
before.
I mean, it will all be great fodder for Mr. Shipman's new book on the inside story of the campaign. And this, means that what we have, what was a disastrous Conservative manifesto launch. Going to war on pensioners and so on, who are the strongest Tory constituency, is an extremely interesting and brave and bold approach. We see that, reporting now that Linton Crosby was furious about this, the Tory strategist and campaign guru, and that there will be a reversion to a much simpler campaign message over the next 10 days, which is basically, somebody has to lead Britain through Brexit and through other difficulties ahead. Should that person be Theresa May, or should it be Jeremy Corbyn? Now, the difficulty for Theresa May, of course, is that her difficult week shows that perhaps she isn't quite as strong and stable, quite as competent as she'd previously suggested.
It's interesting to see Linton Crosby here seems to be elbowing his way into a more prominent role in the campain. Yeah, well, he, of course, was the mastermind of the last election.
Indeed, he's seen as the evil guru of political strategy, and he's going to certainly turn the focus of the Tory attack back to Brexit, because that's kind of slipped off the radar recently. But I can't resist pointing out that it's in page 10 of the Sunday Telegraph, the Conservative supporting Sunday Telegraph, that the report, this very small column here about how the poll gap has narrowed in their ORB poll to only 6 points. And they're also saying that the poll gap narrows as women are turning to Corbyn. Now, and this is contentious, I don't think all the pollsters would necessarily agree with this, but I think there is something strange happening in the undergrowth here. I think Corbyn's manifesto appealed to a lot of people. We know that many of his policies are extremely popular, though he is not regarded as a very credible leader. And I think something could be happening here, and it's a great underdog story, isn't it?
It is. Certainly makes the race a little bit more interesting. Thank you both for joining us and your thoughts on today's newspapers.
Now, she began the week with a humiliating, perhaps unique mid-campaign change to her manifesto with her U-turn on care for the elderly. But we did all forget about that for a few days after Monday night's devastating and tragic attack on Manchester Arena. We came together as a nation, at least for a while, to show solidarity with victims and their families and to defend our vital liberties, our way of life, our democracy. But the so-called special relationship came under strain when US security services leaked sensitive details of the British terror probe. And now we're back to politics almost as normal, with his speech blaming Western military interventions for fomenting terrorism and his taxing and spending plans under scrutiny. So, plenty to ask him in just a few moments, isn't there, Anushka?
There certainly is. And that terror attack, as you might imagine, is dominating again today. This picture of the suicide bomber moments before the massacre on many of the front pages. The Sunday Times leading on nervous Tories because of this tightening in the polls down to 7 points. This story suggests there's been infighting over social care plans, and apparently Sir Linton Crosby wants message discipline. It'll be all about Theresa leading the Brexit talks and, I imagine, all about attacking Jeremy Corbyn, with this story saying he blamed the West for the beheading of Alan Henning by Jihadi John. Now, the polls are squeezing, so could Labour pull off a political shock? Could Corbyn do a Trump, or he might prefer to see it as an Arsene Wenger? Well, this graph would urge caution. Every general election, Ipsos Mori doesn't just ask voting attention, it also says, who do you think is going to win? And guess what? Gut instinct has got it right in the last 6 general elections, which is bad news for Jeremy, because last week 70% of people still thought Theresa May would be walking into Downing Street on June the 9th, although he does have some very cool celebrity backers. The actor Danny DeVito tweeting in London saying, Jeremy, June the 8th, show us how it's done. I may be dreaming here, but if you're out there, Danny, watch the interview and tweet us, #Peston. Robert.
So I'm delighted to be joined by the Lib Dems' Vince Cable and Tasmina Ahmed Sheikh of the SNP. Tasmina, if I could start with you. Obviously, we've got to focus on those appalling events in Manchester. What impact, if any, do you think it'll have on both the conduct of the campaign and possibly the outcome of this election?
First of all, can I say, since this is all still so very numb for very many people, that at least we've seen from the very worst of atrocity has come the very best of humanity, which was demonstrated in the past week. As a mother also of two Ariana Grande fans, we have to think about what this means for young girls and families who want to be sure that their children and young people can go out and enjoy themselves without fear nor favour. I suppose it sort of rebalanced the scales in a certain way, that we think about what's really important, and of course public safety and protection from these terrible criminal and terrorist acts has to be paramount. And I think across the political divides, we all share the same aims and ambitions for our country, and that is to ensure protection of our public at all times. And we must ensure then that this doesn't become a political football in this process, but we recognise that we need to work together. I suppose that's demonstrated slightly by what had Fallon confused Boris Johnson's words with Jeremy Corbyn, that he probably did because people feel the same way about how we have to deal with this issue. And we must make sure that our security service and police forces are properly resourced to deal with these matters.
Do you think that this issue will become a political football in the campaign, Vince?
I sincerely hope it doesn't. I mean, they were horrific, and the wounds are still raw, and people feel deeply about it, and I think will for a long time. But what I think is happening is that, in a remarkable way, that the basic political pain hasn't changed all that much. I mean, the issues which were dominant a week ago, the dementia tax and the U-turn that wasn't a U-turn, and the cutting off of winter fuel allowance for 8 out of 10 pensioners, these issues are still being raised very actively on the doorstep. The polls there's been a bit of a wobble, but they tend to suggest the Conservatives are going to get back still with a very large majority. We can argue about how much. I think the one thing that has happened is that the issue which has dominated election campaigns for decades, which is of economic policy, has largely been drowned out by this quite understandable concern around security. Both Tories and Labour were absolutely trashed a few days ago by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, making their programme simply don't add up economically. Yeah. But that's largely been submerged in the security.
Well, it won't stay submerged for long, and I'm sure we'll be talking a bit about that later.
Well, it's Sunday, and that always means a spate of new opinion polls, and they make for fascinating, if a little confusing, reading. There are 5 new polls today which have the Conservative lead over Labour anywhere from 6 to 14 points. So what's going on? Well, Professor John Curtis is the expert we always turn to at times like this, and he joins me ever faithfully from Glasgow. John Curtis, take us through these polls, because they seem to be all over the place.
Well, they may seem to be all over the place, but in truth there is a very consistent key message from them. Actually, 4 of these 5 polls, if you compare them with what they were saying before the Conservative manifesto launch on the 18th of this month, 4 of them say the Conservatives are down by 2 points, 4 of them say the Labour vote is up by 4 points, and the 5th poll, by the way, also suggests the movement's in the same direction. So the clear, consistent message from the polls is that the Conservative lead has narrowed. Now, why does this matter? It matters because we are now in a position where the leads are such that the Conservatives can no longer be sure of getting the landslide majority they want. Now, you're right, some polls are suggesting they really are in trouble and it's getting to get rather close. Others suggest it's further apart. Now, the truth is there are 2 major sources of variation in the polls, which helps to underline the uncertainty that we're now at. The first is the polls agree young voters are going to vote Labour if they vote. Older voters are going to vote for the Conservatives. But the crucial thing is how many of all those younger voters turn out to vote. The second thing is whether the evidence in the polls that the Conservatives are advancing more in the north of England and the Midlands and elsewhere is realised in the ballot box. If it isn't realised, the Tories' chances of getting a landslide are now beginning to look rather remote. If it is, they could still well indeed get a majority of more than 80 or so.
Right, as you say, the broad message is that the Conservatives have lost some ground to varying degrees depending on which poll you look at. What about the Labour Party?
Oh, the Labour Party is gaining ground. Of course, truth has been gaining grounds in this election, certainly ever since week 1. They started at 26. They're now on average at 35. And it looks as though, particularly what seems to have happened, there were a lot of people out there at the beginning of this election campaign who were saying, well, I usually vote Labour, but the truth is I'm not very sure about Jeremy Corbyn. They seem to have decided that the Labour manifesto wasn't so bad after all. They've looked at Theresa May and they said, well, give me that choice, then you know what, I'm going to stick with Labour. And I think for the most part what's happened is that Labour have managed to draw back into the fold some of their traditional voters who were disenchanted, together with perhaps also crucially some of those younger voters who've never voted before, who of course have always been a particular target for Jeremy Corbyn.
What's your reaction to previous polls and elections where there has been a feeling that some of the Labour support has been overstated? Do you think that could be a worry in this election too?
That's undoubtedly one of the uncertainties that faces the polls and therefore the rest of us in this election. Now, we had a conference on Friday in which it was quite carefully explained. The pollsters have, in various ways, been trying to correct the errors that resulted in overestimation of Labour support 2 years ago, in particular dealing with this issue of turnout amongst younger voters. So you shouldn't assume that the polls are just going to be wrong this time because they were wrong last time. But of course, we won't in truth know whether or not the polls have got it right until June the 9th. But I think the message you can take away, whatever, even if the polls are wrong in terms of the level, they're not wrong in terms of the trend. The trends in this election campaign so far have been dramatic. That big rise in Tory support early on at the expense of UKIP, and subsequently what by historical standards is quite a remarkable rise in Labour support, albeit from a very low initial baseline. So this election has already seen quite a lot of movement, and therefore perhaps we shouldn't rule out the possibility there'll be yet more in the 10 days that are still to come.
John Curtis, thank you very much. Well, that's his analysis of the polls so far. Let's look at the implications with our panel. Julia, first of all, in your mind, how concerned should Conservative headquarters be at this particular point and what looks like an apparent surge by Labour in the polls?
Well, it depends, doesn't it, whether you want to have a massive landslide majority or not, which I'm assuming the Tory party do. Whether that is what the vast majority of voters from any party think is a good idea is a completely different matter. But undoubtedly, the manifesto launch was an absolute disaster.
Over the social care
policy and the U-turn, and I would say the free breakfast and various other things. Lots of stuff in the Labour manifesto was very appealing. What I find fascinating is the tactic from Sir Linton Crosby was very clear. It's all about Theresa May. Don't even mention the candidates, don't mention the party. It's all about Theresa May. And the Labour Party, the candidates on the moderate side are all saying, don't mention Jeremy Corbyn. The party has made it all about Jeremy Corbyn. This has been a battle between two big people. And the more we've seen of Theresa May, the more she's gone down. The more we've seen of Jeremy Corbyn, he's gone up.
And in a way, Steve Richards, Julia alludes to that point that if you make it all about leadership, if you make it all about being strong and stable, and then you do something like a massive, unprecedented U-turn on a key policy like social care, the knock is ever greater. And do you think that is the reason for the change in the polls, or is Labour actually gaining some momentum?
I think it's part of the reason. I mean, you can understand why the focus was on her at the beginning, because her personal ratings were stratospheric. But what is interesting is all successful leaders basically cast a spell over voters and the media. Then none of them are titans, all are flawed. And it's just a question of when the spell is broken. And I think this is a first for a leader's spell to be broken during an election campaign. So that was a moment of high significance. The fact that the Labour Party campaign is more robust than many thought it would be is the other factor. So I think it's the combination of the two that the trend, as John Curtis said, whatever the outcome, the trend has been this narrowing.
Now, there hasn't been much campaigning. In fact, there was local campaigning was resumed, I think, on Thursday, and national campaigning then on Friday. So do you think, Tim Marshall, that the polls in some way are already reflecting what happened in Manchester and people's thoughts about which party will keep them safer?
No, I think that's going to come in the next week. I think it's too soon for that. I think from the very beginning it was quite understandable for the Conservatives of Linton Crosby looking at the campaign to frame it in terms of Mrs May strong and stable and argue it was all about Brexit. But they can argue that till they're blue in the face. The electorate can have its own view, and you always got to go back to Clinton's "it's the economy, stupid." For most of the electorate, it's not framed about Brexit, even though Brexit, of course, is economic. It's framed in your electricity bill. It's framed in your jobs. Both manifestos have got more holes in it than a Swiss cheese. So it comes down to which one of these two manifestos you believe. And the Labour manifesto makes a lot more promises about things you care about, like your electricity bill.
Interesting that in the end, despite what we all thought was going to be the Brexit election, because that's what Theresa May said it would be, it's been a lot about public services.
Hasn't it? And it does always come down to, yes, bread and butter issues, doesn't it? And again, I agree with you. I don't think we've quite seen how the terror issue has played out, because to a certain extent, you know, we've had the Westminster attack only a couple of months ago, for goodness sake. That was already factored in terms of who you trust, who you don't trust. The IRA stuff with Jeremy Corbyn, again, it's already factored in. He's factored in. People actually care about how ordinary government policies affect their lives.
Thank you very much.
I've been getting away with it all.